As an industry, financial services have been regulated to a lesser and greater extent via a myriad of philosophies that since the 1980s have been led by Neo-liberalism. We can find the roots of neoliberalism in the writings of Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises and his protege, Friedrich Hayek. They drew the interest of some very affluent people who identified the opportunity to free themselves from regulation and tax. Hayek received substantial financial support, forming the transatlantic network of academics, businessmen, and journalists known as the Mont Pelerin Society, which was critical in spreading the neoliberal doctrine from Austria to the USA, namely to the likes of Milton Friedman and the others at the Chicago School of Economics. This expanded and escalated neoliberalism in the US between the 50s and the 70s, led by the likes of Chicago's Milton Friedman and, of course, Eugene Fama through the 1970s. Wealthy sponsors in the US helped fund various think tanks that broadcast neoliberal ideology, allowing it by the 1980s to have fully penetrated the political ranks of the Reagan and Thatcher administrations in the US and UK. As neoliberalism became the dominant economic view, deregulation became an inevitable outcome. For example, as we saw in the UK in the 1986 Big Bang. But, and there are big reasons why markets may not work perfectly, or may not achieve the desired outcome from society's point of view. Where this is the case, it requires governments to impose regulations upon the market, assuming the benefits of such intervention to society are likely to exceed the costs. Because money talks. The City of London Corporation in its annual report notes that $75 billion it contributed in taxes to the UK Treasury in 2019 and 2020, or more than 10% of the Treasury's income, whilst employing 1.1 million voters and displaying more resilience to the pandemic than many other sectors. In his July 2021 paper, A New Chapter for Financial Services, ex-hedge fund manager, now Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, set out his desire for a more competitive industry through what he describes as an attractive and internationally recognised ecosystem across both regulation and tax. The strapline is one of competition and consumer protection being codependent. But is that true, and is that the Treasury's strategy? For example, take the final report of the Task Force for Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform. The Tigger Report, no doubt inspired by Pooh's friend, chosen as one imagines to appeal to Boris Johnson's leaning to all things bouncy and childish, was set up to set out on a mission to identify opportunities after Brexit. The goal set for the group's lead, Ian Duncan Smith, was to ensure that business can scale up unencumbered by any administrative burdens. In other words, a proposed deregulated UK, or certainly less regulated UK market. Not just financial services, but across the entire economy. Phoebe Clay of Unchecked UK published a paper entitled Tigger's Final Report, What Lies Behind the Drive for Deregulation, and wrote, "Public protections are not part of the Tigger's agenda, including in relation to new technologies. References to protecting the vulnerable, evaluating risks, or the pursuit of the public good are in short supply in the Tigger Report. Among the regulations in the Tigger sites is MiFID II. On page 20 of the report, it sets out steps to relax regulation, stating regulators must be given a clear mandate by politicians to foster competition, facilitate the growth of key emerging technologies, accommodate new business models, and remove unnecessary regulatory barriers that obstruct innovation. Instead of their goal being only to avoid risk, they should be encouraged to allow new models to be piloted and to work collaboratively with industry to manage risk and review regulation." On page 32, the report notes outside the EU and with control over our financial regulation for the first time in 50 years, we have a unique opportunity to reform the rules. We can see this through proposals in the report to reduce laws with more delegation to select committees, raising the charge cap for auto-enrolment and relaxing Solvency II rules by reducing risk buffer margins, liberalising open finance to boost fintech, deregulating commodity clearing markets, reducing anti-money laundering compliance, changing the matching adjustments for defined benefit schemes, increasing aggregate exposure to startup and illiquid assets, and launching a centralised cryptocurrency. So what's really happening here? Moreover, on page 46, the report proposes to amend, reduce, transparency and disclosure requirements, including the removal of cost and charges disclosure, permanent removal of best execution reporting, reducing market abuse regulations, confining the PRIPS and key investor document to only complex products, to reduce data protection by replacing GDPR. The motive is to increase private ownership of the UK's ageing infrastructure and to foot the bill of UK's net zero commitments through pension savers' money. The propaganda play is one of restoring UK common law principles to financial services while boosting savers' pensions, greening the economy and levelling up the UK. The outcome, however, is one of deregulation. This is all well exemplified on page 39 that it seeks to amend MiFID II to introduce greater flexibility to remain competitive in commodity markets and rights. Without reform, the UK will remain at a competitive disadvantage compared to other global financial centres in attracting new commodities markets. Which brings us to regulatory capture, which we can define as, sometimes referred to as agency capture or client politics. Regulatory capture is a form of corruption of authority that occurs when a political entity, policymaker or regulator is co-opted to serve the commercial, ideological or political interests of a minor constituency, such as a particular geographic area, industry, profession or ideological group. In our case, financial services. So when most people mention the free market, what they mean are markets with unobstructed competition, with zero or self-regulation and no government intervention. Market practice and outcomes arise only between buyers and sellers. High profit margins lead to high tax receipts and capital flows. These are attractive to governments and form the basis of global competition. This then creates a conflict and opens politicians and regulators to capture. High regulatory costs, meanwhile, incentivise participant firms to seek to engage policymakers and regulators, to minimise those costs and taxation, to capture them and perpetuate motivations, havens and workarounds. Barriers to entry are kept high due to high initial regulatory costs, which helps serve to protect the profit margins of incumbents. We may have banned cash for questions, but now we have a generation of regulators and politicians who quickly take up lucrative non-executive director positions with financial firms, during or indeed after office, just as junior civil servants and regulators move from regulator to the regulated and back again throughout their careers. For example, many private firms are now owned by private equity firms or other investors who are investing our pension money, and there's very little visibility on their true metrics. The private equity industry has become so big that more transparency is now needed. Transparency in public market is no longer enough. This is a huge regulatory arbitrage. Which brings us to Preventable Surprises and its CLAP project, the Corporate Lobbying Alignment Project, or CLAP, by Preventable Surprises will work to make corporate political capture a central component of investors' approach to ESG stewardship and integration. So the symptoms of neoliberalism and deregulation is to reduce transparency for customers, capture regulators and policymakers, and leads to the creation of regulatory arbitrage that firms can pursue unchecked. When regulatory capture occurs, that special interest is escalated over the interest of the public, which commentators argue leads to a net loss for society. I have quickly covered neoliberalism as it informs policy and deregulation, the growing uncertainty around UK regulation strategy post-Brexit, and the rising risk of regulatory capture. I call on the TTF to publicly support the CLAP project as an integral part of its battleground to fight deregulation of UK financial services. Thank you.